morning. My name is Harry Oberg, Mayor of Prescott, and we're out here today to take a look at the forest surrounding Prescott. And I have with me Ben Dubois of the U.S. Forest Service, and he's going to give you a lot more information on what we have out here. But what I want to do was kind of show you what we consider to be an unhealthy forest situation. There's a lot of risks to that, and then in a few minutes we'll go ahead and take a look at a healthy forest that has been restored and the benefits that's going to provide to us. So maybe, Ben, you can just kind of tell us why this is unhealthy.
So yeah, the part of the forest that we're standing in right now, we haven't done any thinning in here, so this is largely a result of past conditions where we suppressed fires. We had a lot of mining and logging activity early on in Prescott's history, 1860s or so. So we suppressed fire. We no longer allowed it to come through and thin out the forest. So what you're looking at now is an overly dense forest. You can see around us there's a lot of ladder fuels. This area is very susceptible to bark beetles in the future. If we had another drought, I would expect to see a lot of bark beetle mortality in this area. So if you look behind you right here, you can see we've got what I was describing as ladder fuels. Those act as a ladder. Say if we had a wildfire in here, it would start out in the understory, climb up into these trees, and eventually carry it on up into the canopy. And because this area is so dense now, it would carry a crown fire, a stand replacing event, which is something we definitely don't want. We're right next to the community of Groom Creek, and so we've got houses right there, so it's definitely something we want to avoid. And so if you also take a look down at the understory, you can see that it's primarily, there's a few shrubs here and there, but a lot of this is dominated by just a thick layer of pine needles. There's no room for the grasses and the forbs to come up. So, yeah.
And I think also when you have a fire, it creates such a hot condition, it sterilizes the ground, right?
Yes, it's very unhealthy for our watershed to have such a high intensity event. It's not, it'll kill a lot of these trees that are not used to that kind of a fire. They're used to a low intensity fire. So yeah, no, the implications of a catastrophic wildfire would be huge for the city and the neighbors around here.
And again, I think this does take a lot of moisture out of the aquifer. In other words, a lot of water doesn't get to the ground, and with a lot of trees and vegetation, it sucks a lot of water out too.
It does, and it intercepts a lot of the precipitation too. If you come in here, say in the wintertime when it snows, you'll see a lot less snow underneath the trees and more in these little openings. So yeah, it does intercept a lot of the precipitation as well.
So by making this a healthy forest, we should be able to improve the water conditions of the aquifer, and we should reduce fire risk.
Correct.
At a minimum.
At a minimum. We're also restoring natural processes, which is usually beneficial for a lot of wildlife species. Folks ask us, where are some of the best places to hunt? It's often where we've done prescribed burns and thinning treatments, where we have a whole new set of understory species that they enjoy, a new flush of growth that they need to persist.
Now I think you're going to have a forest sale here.
Yep, we are standing in one of the units of the schoolhouse timber sale, which we will be prepping and offering later this year. What that'll involve is bringing in mechanical equipment to actually go in and thin out the forest. So we'll be targeting a lot of these smaller trees that, again, act as ladder fuels, trying to reduce the overall density so that the forest is more resilient to insects, fire, diseases, the whole suite of disturbances that we get in the forest. So the Forest Service will oversee that contract, and we utilize local loggers to do that. So it's important for the local economy as well. Unfortunately, right now, we don't have the best markets for that kind of material. We're hoping to be able to utilize some of this smaller diameter material that we have all over. We can usually utilize trees down to about a 5-inch diameter. Anything less than that, we have to thin out and then put in piles and burn. So hopefully,
so that's called slash?
That's what we would consider
so
slash.
When we see smoke sometimes in the summertime,
or in the wintertime when we're burning piles.
That's burning those slash piles.
Correct.
And we were just at all lands meeting this week where we're looking at an industry come in and actually utilize that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. As well as utilizing the tops of the trees and the branches. Those are, right now there is no market for that in the local area. So yeah, we would like to utilize that and reduce the smoke impacts we have on the community.
Okay. So I think we've got a pretty good understanding what it looks like for an unhealthy forest. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at a healthy restored forest?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds good.
And now we move to an area where you restored, and I think you said, Ben, This was restored a few months ago?
Actually, you're looking at a series of treatments that we've done on the landscape. This is the old Loba timber sale that we did about a decade ago.
Oh, okay.
Since that time, we've burned it twice, and we just completed a mastication contract where they basically ground up all the shrubs that were coming up, and we're going to do another prescribed burn this coming fall. So you're looking at a lot of work that's been completed to get to get the forest in this kind of condition.
It looks like a lot of the trees in here are about the same size.
They are.
So I think you want to have some new shoots coming up to start getting a generational effect to the trees, right?
We do. Most of the trees around the city of Prescott date back to about the 1860s, 1870s, when a lot of the mining activity occurred. So one of the things we try to do is that what you just described, we want to try to get another age class, another kids. We want to get kids on the land again. So if you look behind us, there's a couple little pockets of what we call regeneration, where the ponderosa pine have reseeded in. Ponderosa pine needs sunlight to regenerate. They don't, that last area we were in, they're not going to regenerate in there. There's too many trees, it's too thick, there's not enough sunlight. By opening up the canopy like this, opening up the forest, we allow for that regeneration to occur.
Okay. Does fire also help in the restoration process as far as germinating seeds?
It does. It's an essential process. So they need bare mineral soil to be able to regenerate, and fire is the best method to do that. It does clear off a lot of the shrubs and the excess fuel that's on the ground there. It also releases nutrients back into the soil. So it's an essential process in restoration treatments.
And I think the thing I noticed between here and the other place we were just at is the amount of grass.
Yes, absolutely.
And so it looks like the grass recovers pretty quickly.
It does.
Does it do it in a few months or a year or 2 years?
Within a year or two, especially after we've done a prescribed burn to remove that thick layer of needles that was covering the forest floor. Once we remove that, there's often a lot of seed in the seed bank that's been sitting there waiting all this time to germinate. If we had come back here, say in August or September during the monsoon season, this is a lush green, there's wildflowers all over the place, so it's really quite spectacular to see that change from that unhealthy condition that we looked at before.
And obviously this is going to be better for wildlife habitat.
Absolutely, absolutely. Whenever we're doing any of these kind of projects, you'll see all the critters running around in the forest. And we talked about the benefits for the watershed, benefits to the community. This could still burn, but it's going to be of much lower intensity compared to what we were looking at before.
Right. And it looks like this would help to hold water. So I think you would have less runoff here than you would where you don't have any grasses growing whatsoever.
More of it's gonna make it to the soil. Less is gonna be intercepted by the canopy of the trees. So yeah.
So it holds the water here to where it has a chance to percolate in.
Yeah.
More than over there where it's just pine needles and it just runs off.
Correct. Yep.
Maybe we can talk a little bit, to be able to come in and do work here. I know there's some federal regulations or laws that we have to look at, NEPA and the Antiquities Act. Can you just kind of explain some of the process of what we have to do before we can actually get an industry come in here and start harvesting? And
Sure.
whether it's for a timber sale or it's going to be for biomass products.
So the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, requires that we analyze any potential impacts we would have on the land prior to implementing anything. So each of the ologists, you've got your hydrologist, your soil scientist, your wildlife biologist, your archaeologist, so all the ologists kind of basically analyze the treatments we're proposing to do. And they want to ensure that we don't have negative impacts, and if there are going to be negative impacts, how can we mitigate those? What kind of techniques can we do to minimize that? So it's a lengthy process, but a necessary process that we have to comply with. And the end result is usually something really good like this once we get through that. You mentioned the Antiquities Act that requires heritage surveys for archaeological sites, so we want to make sure we're not, especially when we're using mechanical equipment, we don't want to run any equipment through an archaeological site. So they have to survey the area prior to us bringing any equipment in and doing any activities on the ground. So again, lengthy process, but a necessity.
Yeah, and I think once you do a NEPA study, it's good for a period of time, and then if that time lapses, it has to be renewed.
Correct. Generally, the common time frame is about a decade. It's about the life of any environmental analysis that we do. We could revisit that after a decade to see if conditions have changed, and if they have, what kind of changes do we need to make for that.
Okay.
But that's so whenever we do a big project like that, we usually have kind of a 10-year implementation plan for that to try to accomplish that.
Okay. For the forests that are surrounding Prescott, how much of this has been already included in a NEPA?
Immediately around the city, it's pretty much all covered under several past decisions, as well as what we call the Bradshaw Environmental Assessment. We call it Bradshaw Vegetation Management. That's what we're implementing at the moment, and you're actually looking at one of the last timber sales we have in the Prescott Basin. We have one here, and then Copper Basin, and then we've covered the bulk of the basin with kind of that initial entry. One thing that's hard for people to understand is even though this looks nice, this is still not quite restored condition yet. It's going to take multiple entries over time to get back to a much healthier condition. So maybe 20 or 30 years from now, we may have to do another mechanical thinning to get it back to get more of those different age classes in the forest, and yeah.
And I think we're doing pretty good on the NEPAs, but as I understand it, the long pole in the tent is probably the archaeological study. Is that correct? Or
not so much for right,
along?
not so much for right around the city of Prescott, because we've done so much activity over the last decade or two. We pretty much have really good heritage clearance in the Prescott Basin.
Okay.
Beyond that, then yes, we've got a lot of work to do beyond the Prescott Basin, say parts north of here, or even south of here in the lower parts of the Bradshaw Mountains.
Right. Well, until we have an opportunity to get a healthy forest, we're going to continue to have wildfire conditions. So I think what I'd like to do is go look at an area where you've actually put in a fire break.
Okay, we could do that.
And kind of make people understand that until we can get proper management of the forest here with a healthy forest and removing all the overburden, fire breaks are an essential element of trying to make sure we keep Prescott safe.
Correct. And one thing to point out is we have a variety of different vegetation types around the city. So some areas are ponderosa pine forests like this. Other areas are more of a chaparral community, which has a very different fire regime, and that's where the fuel breaks are essential. Chaparral communities kind of more brush dominated, like Manzanita. They have a very high intensity stand replacing event is kind of their natural fire regime, which is totally opposite of our ponderosa pine. And so that kind of a fire regime doesn't work very well with people living right next to it. So that is why you see a lot of those different mastication treatments, fuel breaks, right up against people's houses to protect those communities.
Okay, so let's go take a look at a fire break.
All right.
Well, Ben, we've moved to an area where you've done some clearing, basically a fire break. And I think if once they have a chance to pan this area, they'll see that it's been cleared out quite a bit. And right behind us is private land. We're standing on Forest Service land right now, I believe.
Correct.
And that's private land that has not been cleared. And because the vegetation is so close together, the fire transmits from one bush to the next to the next. Right?
Correct. We would call that horizontal fuel continuity. So yeah, it's kind of a continuous fuel layer going that direction. So what we tried to do here is, because we have a local community here, we're right near Oak Knoll Village, we put a fuel break right along the forest boundary in both directions, kind of as a last resort to try to protect this community if we had a high intensity wildfire coming this direction. What that buys us here is it gives us a place for, we can put firefighters in here to try to protect some of the structures. Yeah, it's a very strategic location for a fuel break.
So it's kind of like establishing a fire line?
It is. It's in most places it's about 200 feet wide, which is not huge, but it's enough to give you somewhere to start from.
So how do you maintain it like this? Because I mean, if you don't maintain it, you'll get brush growing back just like this.
No, that's a good question. So every couple of years, we'll have to come back in here to maintain these.
Okay. So do you get contracts to do that?
We do. We compete for funds with other agencies to hire contractors to implement this kind of a project. And this was several hundred acres. This actually goes all the way over to Walker Road, so it follows along the ranch, so right up against the mall in that direction. So it's a pretty big project, but yeah, it was completed by contractors.
Okay. You tell me that in the city we have a lot of Firewise communities.
We do. We have over
they've
30.
done a good job of trying to clear around their own homes.
It's a work in progress. Some communities have been more proactive than others. Other communities like this haven't really done a lot of mitigation work yet. And so our message is we would love it if folks on the private side or other agencies would complement our efforts. And so we're always trying to coordinate with the city, with the Department of Forestry and Fire Management, BLM, Natural Resource Conservation Service. We're always trying to partner with other agencies and entities to try to implement more effective treatments if we treat on both sides of the line. So the city has been very proactive in that, and I hope you guys continue to do that. We appreciate your guys' efforts as well. And it just makes our treatments that much more effective.
Well, thanks, Ben. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to come out here and show us what you're doing from the Forest Service standpoint. We think it's very valuable, and we appreciate it in Prescott.
Excellent.
So,
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I've got 3 guests with me today, and since they've got some very long titles, I'll let them go ahead and identify themselves. I'll start with Laura.
Well, thank you, Mayor. I'm Laura Lee Nye. I happen to be a councilwoman in Prescott Valley, but for today's purposes, I'm chair of the Upper Verde, and I'm going to shorten it, Coalition.
Okay. John?
Thank you, Mayor. John Munderloh, I'm the Water Resources Manager with the town of Prescott Valley. And for today's purposes, I also do double duty as the chairman of the technical committee for the Upper Verde Coalition.
Russ?
I'm Russ Shoemate. I'm a forester and firefighter. My job is Northwest District Manager with the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management, and part of the coalition as well as working in forestry here in the Prescott, Yavapai County area for the last 20 years.
Okay. So your district is basically just Yavapai County?
My Northwest District is Yavapai County and Southern Mojave County south of the Big Ditch.
Okay, good.
Big.
Yesterday we had an opportunity to go out in the forest, Prescott Forest, and I wanted the viewers to have an opportunity to see what an unhealthy forest looked like. Also an area that had been restored. I kind of explained very briefly some of the issues and risks of having an unsafe, unhealthy forest, and also the benefits of a restored forest. And we also took a moment and took a look at an area that's been cleared by the Forest Service, and I guess even to some extent the state forestry, creating a fire break to the south and southwest of town to try and protect us from the danger of wildfires. But I think the first thing, and maybe I'd start with you, John, what is biomass, and why is it a benefit to remove it from the forest?
Right, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mayor. The issue for us, of course, is we're water managers. We have to provide water to our communities, and our water supply, by and large, depends on the health of the watershed. So the infiltration through the watershed when we get rains into the aquifers are primary source of supply. There was a study in 2006 from the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, that explained to us, that determined that of all the rainfall we get, precipitation and snowfall, only 2% of the total reaches our aquifers. So we're living on 2% of what is, generally thought of as a fairly small rainfall amount. And so we needed, that pointed out the need to better manage our watersheds. What's happening to the other 98% of that rainfall is it's being consumed by plants on the surface of the ground. So as we started looking at why is that, why do some other areas in the state have 5% of their precipitation reaching the aquifer, for instance, in neighboring watersheds? And the answer is that we've had encroachment of juniper onto former grasslands, and it's a huge problem. It's everywhere. It has been going on in a progressive state, a slow progressive state, for generations. And so the need is to try to address our watershed health, return it to its natural grassland conditions, not to denude the forest, but to return natural grassland conditions and open up the forest. There's multiple benefits besides for simply increasing recharge into the aquifer, including wildlife. benefits, wildfire, reducing wildfire intensity, better grazing, and better water supplies. Also, might mention we've recently had a number of controlled burns around the Prescott area, as we do this time of year every year. Those controlled burns are trying to get rid of material that has been cut back. But we're proposing an idea of using the material that's just being cut and left on the ground or cut and burned to invigorate an industry, a biomass industry. So taking that material, turning it into something valuable, an energy source, a soil amendment source. There's numerous potential uses for it.
So basically it'd be any woody material, whether or not it'd be brush
Yeah.
or actual trees or even the tops of trees?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
How,
And Russ-
how many
yeah.
components are there in what we call biomass? We forgot to ask that when we were together before. There's the juniper and there's shrub.
Uh-huh.
Is there any other element?
Well, biomass from a forestry's perspective would be anything that isn't historically had a marketable component to it, which historically has been round wood. The stem of the tree is what the marketable portion it has historically been, and biomass would be anything other than that. The slash produced when you're cutting the limbs off the stems of the tall trees. As you go into shorter non-timber species, it would be really the entire plant.
Right.
As you cut it down, there really has historically been no market, so that would be what's considered biomass. Brush would be considered biomass, however, we're probably not looking at really being able to utilize that as of yet. Technologies are such that the markets really don't want the brush biomass, and the ability to collect it's very difficult as well without pulling in a lot of dirt and stuff. So the utilitarian side of biomass is going to have some targeted portions of all of the biomass that's out there. It's mostly going to be the tree species and the limbs off the tree species that we're already utilizing parts of.
So the answer is actually complicated.
Yeah. So I guess what you're saying is brush then would be masticated, which I think you call just chipping it up and leaving it there on the ground.
Correct. There's different ways to do it. The most cost effective is going to be burning. Then you'd go to a masticator mechanical treatment, and then down to hand treatment. Depending on what area you're working in, you'd have to pick the right tool for it. But by far the cheapest is to do a landscape broadcast burn and just burn it to reduce that biomass component to reduce
But
water interception and all that stuff.
But I think that's been the issue, is we haven't been burning our forests. I mean, we've had this decades-long policy to stop burns before they propagate, because we're living now, up to and next to the forest and in it. So we don't have burns anymore, and it's hard to even have controlled burns.
Yeah.
If a controlled burn gets out of control, then, the agencies that are responsible for it get sued, and so we
Yep.
generally just don't have controlled burns anymore. So we're trying to figure out a way to get the biomass, the water-using trees off of the forest floor, open up the forest more without, at this point, using fire, I guess, is a method.
Russ, I think Ben Dubois pretty much yesterday explained the nature of how fires start, going into ladder fuse, going up in the crown. And but how do we get to the point we have such unhealthy, unsafe forests, number one? And the second thing is, when we have devastating fires, what is the result? I understand that it creates tremendous problems.
Yes, great question. The first one's a fairly long one, so I'll condense it and summarize it. It's a long time in the making, so it's a very complex situation, but it boils down to, in essence, unmanaged cattle grazing in the 19th century really slicked off the grasslands, and the natural progression of the woody species are always seeding and always growing, but a grassland burns very frequently and would kill back the woody species. So what happened with the influx of European settlement, you had huge numbers of unmanaged grazing that took the grasses down, eliminated the fires, and started the woody species not getting knocked back. As the federal government took control of management of vast portions of the West, the thinking of the time was we need to keep the resource, which we feel is important, which in most cases was timber, from being eliminated, which was being burnt. So they started suppressing fires as well. As they started managing grazing, the grasses could come back to healthy levels, but the fire was not allowed to take its natural role again and push back the woody species out of those grasslands, and in the ponderosa pine forest, keep the numbers of trees fairly low, numbers of trees per acre. So all that combined over time created more woody species over more numbers of woody species over a greater land area and less grassland. And in our tall timber, the ponderosa pine, it created a thicker forest. And since everything evolved with fire in it, I kind of kicked around the ecology of everything to now when you have a high intensity fire in the ponderosa pine, they weren't evolved to deal with those, so you tend to eliminate a lot of ponderosa pine with higher intensity fires that we have in there. The grasslands were very frequent low intensity fires. Now we have more brush and juniper out there. With the brush, you typically get high intensity fires that can tend to maybe not sterilize the soil so much as create a hydrophobic effect in it, depending on the soils. But you can have effect of eliminating water penetration in the soils, which has some far-reaching effects.
Creates more erosion.
In the areas where you had lots of juniper invade, what has happened is they have a tendency to knock out the species around them with the chemical components that they put into the soil, and you eliminate the grass understory, and you start eroding your topsoil, and you start losing topsoil because there's nothing there to hold it. So that's the kind of the gist of the problem that was kind of started as European settled the Southwest. Fire and management's always occurred, though. The native people utilized fire extensively. They extensively used resources and moved along and let the landscapes heal. So it's not like management has never occurred, but the way the management took place over the last 150 years has really accelerated the degraded landscape of the grasslands and the forests.
I just, if I could, key on one thing regarding the soils, and I hear often people's concerned about removing the junipers, that it will somehow cause or create soil erosion. But I've seen time and time again where soil erosion occurs because the junipers are there. They've denuded the grasslands underneath of them because they outcompete the grasslands. And you can see occasion after occasion of a head cut moving right through juniper roots. You know, the junipers just don't do anything to contain the soil and keep it from eroding.
The head cut is the start of an erosion?
Start of an erosion or a gully,
okay.
yeah. And, you know, so it'll start cutting down and then it'll propagate upstream and go right through those juniper roots. They do nothing to hold it back.
You know, foresters are all about trees, are a big part of controlling erosion, and they do have a big role in that. But I'm a proponent of grasses, and leafy forbs are far more effective in erosion control than most tree species, especially in the West.
Well, and I think especially in areas where the junipers aren't supposed to be, you know, where they were native grasslands before and they've now become juniper predominant. And those soils are, I think, in danger. And one thing we got out of the rancher panel the other day was how important the soils are.
Yeah, we'll be going into that in the second portion of our discussion today, talking about that conference and what brought it together, who was there, and what we see are the benefits of that conference and the next steps as a result of having that conference. But I think one thing I read or heard from the SRP sometime back was that I think we've lost about 2/5 of our ponderosa forest with some of the major fires we've had in the last few
Correct.
years. I guess
Two of the major fires.
Two?
Fires
Just
took out
two.
2/5 of it.
Okay. So I know that at one point, I was told we had the largest standing ponderosa forest in the world.
Correct.
I'm not sure if we're there anymore.
Northern Arizona and New Mexico.
Correct.
I mean, it still is. It's just
Okay.
smaller now.
Okay. Well, we
But
want
it is the largest continuous stand-up.
we definitely want to save it. But I understand where there have been these catastrophic fires. It's very difficult for the land to come back and be restored and get kind of a renewable forest level on it. But you get a lot of erosion, soil, ash going into the water, and it goes into our lakes. And you know, I was talking to SRP, and they said they spent a lot of money having to use filters and I guess other means to try and clean the water to get that out of it. And so I think they would be probably a proponent to help us in trying to make sure we manage the forest.
And you know, there's a point that I would like to make because our citizens don't often understand. We're talking about crown fires here. There's ground fires and there's crown fires. And the crown fires are absolutely devastating compared. Ground fires are healing. It returns, you know, an area to a natural state. Crown fires, most forests, do they ever recover from a crown fire? Can they recover?
In the Southwest, so depending on the vegetation type, crown fires are natural fires in some vegetation types. Not many in the state of Arizona until you get into some of the really high, the San Francisco peaks, that mixed conifer forest would be stand replacement fires. So the Schultz fire that burned up there a few years ago is actually a natural fire for that ecosystem. Ponderosa pine ecosystem does not do well with crown fires,
Correct.
which is why the Wallow fire and the Rodeo Chetasky fire did such a huge impact to that area. Grasslands are low intensity frequent fires as well as ponderosa pine. In fact, ponderosa pine in a natural state is more of a grassland with pine trees around it. However, a brush field, and there are a lot of areas where brush is the native correct species for that topography. That is a stand replacement fire, which is a natural fire. So it all depends on the vegetation type, what it evolved with, and the soils in there, and all that. It's all one system, and it works in that setup. But the biggest point to say is when you have catastrophic fire,
Right.
you're going to see a major change in what was there. Nature's always going to fill the void with something, but if you go put a crown fire through ponderosa pine forest, you're probably not going to see ponderosa pine forest return
Exactly.
for a very long time. If you take fire out of a grassland, you're going to have a change. The grassland's going to disappear, and you're going to have it taken over by woody species, which are brush and juniper and pinyon. They'll move out of their historic areas and encroach. So you can always say that catastrophic fire is going to have an impact on the ecosystem, and it's our value system that makes it good or bad. And we've historically said that's bad. We like the ponderosa pines here, so we don't want to see that eliminated. We like the grasslands, we don't want to see that eliminated.
Right.
And people might not know it. I'm sure you realize it. The ponderosa pine is fairly fire resistant. So if you have low intensity grass fires going through, the bark pretty much saves the tree. It's only when you have the ladder fields that allow enough heat to
Yes.
start going up into the lower branches
Right.
and then it goes into the crown that you actually lose the tree.
Exactly.
Or the other thing we've seen historically, because of the elimination of frequent fires, you get a buildup of litter on the forest floor. And when that litter starts burning, it puts a heat spike into the soil. And the ponderosa pine aren't very good at dealing with that either. They'll die from a heat spike into their root system.
Well, and
They're
don't,
evolved for their thick bark to protect them as that quick moving grass fire runs around them.
and some of the fires kill all the seed. It's just the natural fall of seed. And that's why historically it can take such a long time for a forest to recover, because even the grass seed is gone.
Right. Well, I think it's very important for us to talk about this conference we had today on the 15th, the All Hands, All Lands conference that was set up by the Upper Verde River Watershed Protection Coalition.
Yes,
was
well
able to get it all
done,
out.
well done.
So when we come back,
And the Arizona Department of Forestry, if I remember.
Exactly, they're our
Yes.
partners and NRCD.
In the two NRCDs, yes, Triangle and Chino Winds.
and yeah, I didn't mean to leave them out by any means.
They're
I
not
was just
going
trying
to
to get
let
that
you
one out
do
without
that.
stumbling over it. So anyway, when we come back, why don't we talk about that and why we think biomass, a biomass industry here is necessary and what benefit it's going to have for us, and why we're looking at this market-based approach. Welcome back to the Prescott Today Show. My name's Harry Oberg. My guests today are Laura Lee Nye, John Mundelow, and Russ Shoemate. We just had a discussion recently in the last few minutes about the forest situation here and why we feel there's a need to remove biomass from the forest. What we're going to do now is talk about a major conference that was held this week, put on, initiated, I think, pretty much by the Upper Verde River Watershed Protection Coalition. And I think it was a very important conference, and maybe you can just tell us a little bit the genesis of what brought everybody together and where we're trying to go with this whole thing.
Well, the very words you just spoke were the important component, and that was bringing all the stakeholders together, everyone who has an opinion, a concern, or a need. And as I stated at that meeting, as far as I was concerned, we had a historic moment because, to my knowledge, we had never had that exact same combination of state agencies, local agencies, citizens, in particular our landowners. We had not had them all there to have a conversation together. And it was so rewarding to me that we had enough of a comfort zone that people got cranky, and I loved it. They told it like it is, and that's what we wanted to happen.
And I think we had representatives from our state and national legislatures there.
Yes.
So that if we were looking at anything that might have to be done in the way of
Yep.
state law or U.S. law, that they might be able to have some influence on that. And I think we had the U.S. Forest Service there and some other agencies too, right?
Absolutely. We had representatives, from the state land.
Yeah.
We even had our state forester. He was one of our keynote speakers. One of our keynote speakers was Senator Pierce, which was a blessing to us because he's also a landowner. Mm-hmm. And it was fun for me to kind of move around and listen into conversations. And there was some confusion by why some people were there, but we cleared that up pretty darn quick. I mean, we were direct, we were on point, and I don't think anybody left there not knowing what our issue was.
Right.
And again, it was our concern for biomass, removing it so we can get water into our aquifer and make money doing it.
Right. So I guess maybe I need to ask, why are we looking at a market-based approach to trying to do something with our biomass?
Well, the issues you have on the treatments we need to do out in the grasslands, the pinyon juniper areas, it's fairly expensive. And so the question becomes is, should taxpayer dollars be completely used as the sole source to eliminate the excess biomass on the grasslands, or is there a better model to either get more acres, defer some cost, not push the cost on just taxpayers or the landowners who want to do it on their private lands?
Right.
But the problem being it's a very low value item, and transportation costs will really eat into it. So what we hope to have is increase the pace and scale enough that we can get a sustainable model to help create more acres treated due to a lower cost per acre with at least some deferring of, or
Right.
defraying of cost with the market,
I
or even maybe even at some point, hopefully the pace and scale could be to where it is a commodity that can be sold, like timber.
You know what? And I forgot an element of our guests. We had 5 biomass industries, industries that require biomass that were at our meeting. One of them came all the way from British Columbia, isn't that correct? Now, the reason I want to make a point about that, why would they come all the way from British Columbia if we didn't have a viable product?
Yeah, it's we have a long ways to go to try to connect the ends. As Russ said, it's scalability and it's got to be economical. And we're trying to get there. It's not there yet. But the current model doesn't work. We have to change it.
Yeah.
Our current model is to go and beg for some federal dollars, and then go through various federal processes or state processes to apply those dollars to the land, to cut some junipers, and in which case they're normally cut and left on the ground. So, for instance, we were successful with the Upper Verde Coalition. We received in a joint grant with the Arizona Game and Fish Department $1.5 million to go out and cut juniper. About $1 million of that dollars is directed towards projects we want. That $1 million will cut about 5,000 acres. We have a 1 million acre problem in
Yeah.
Yavapai County. So all that effort, $1 million sounds like a lot of money, but it only addresses a very, very small portion of what we need to address. We have to scale it up. We have to increase the tempo of it if we're ever going to get back into a state where the watershed is where it's supposed to be. And we're just not going to do it with federal and state grants. So scaling it up with private industry is, I think, the obvious answer.
Right. And I think we have some industries on the eastern side of the state. I think one producing some kind of forest product.
Correct.
I don't know if it was MDF board or what. And then I think another use of it over there is actually to produce some energy, power plant or something of that nature. But I understand that juniper really is not good for forest products. It's a good burning product. It could be utilized, like we're going to probably talk about here in a few minutes, about Drake and what they're going to be trying to do out there to utilize it to burn with coal. And I think up to now, we've only looked at it as being maybe a fuel source for stoves and things of that nature. But now we need to start looking at, is there other agricultural uses? I think the one company we heard from in Mexico, Missouri, talked about aromatics.
Right,
actually being able-
essential oils.
Essential
We've
oils,
got to get that term out there because the ladies will get it. You remember I was teased about that.
Yeah, and also I guess they make biochar now, which it can be put into the soil, which can add nutrients to the soil and also help with water retention. And then of course the other thing is a biocoal, which if you process this in a certain way and you add it to a coal-fired power plant, only 5% of it coming from the woodland, it reduces the overall carbon output or CO2 output from the power plant by 11%. And some people I've talked to said that, if you can get the right mix, it's possible that you could actually get it down below what the EPA
Right.
says right now is the upper limit on which you can have for release of carbon. So maybe we can talk about some of these processes that we heard. I think I know Jeff Whitney went out to Mexico, Missouri, and he was very happy with that process. I think another one we heard was a biogas,
Yes.
where they can not only use the wood biomass that we have, but they would take other waste streams, solid waste. They would take
Yeah.
I have the municipal waste stream
Yeah.
as well as an agricultural waste stream, correct?
Yeah.
Manure.
Yeah, and so maybe we can talk about some of these processes. And I think one of the things we need to look at is, you know, in the we had that one we looked at about a year ago, where I think it was a company out of Montana wanted to come in here, but they were going to have a very fixed site. Everything had to come into that fixed site.
Right, and they only wanted pellets to produce pellets.
Right, pellets, and I think they wanted some kind of silage or something for
Right.
animals or something. But
You-
the big thing was you had all the transportation costs of bringing the material in. I think if we can start looking at any kind of an industry that can cut on site and produce the product and not have to go into a central facility, that would be important. So what was your opinions of what you saw of the various people out there that thought they had a product
Well, thanks
or
for,
process?
yeah, Russ is the expert on this part of it, but from a non-expert opinion, not knowing a lot about the biomass industry, I would say that we are seeing innovation driving forward.
Yep.
There's companies that are seeing profit potential and they're innovating, like the company from Mexico, the Biogas Corporation. They're driving innovation forward, and costs are starting to come down on production, and costs are starting to go up on profit margins. So we're seeing that, but Russ certainly knows a lot more about the specifics than I
Yeah,
do.
you know, from a market standpoint, we've got the two endpoints kind of identified. We have an amazing supply. So
Yeah.
some of the challenge of assuring that supply to industry is what we're working on now, to give them some investment grade numbers to say actually how much we have and what the form of that biomass is, because the form being all needles and twigs is different if there's some bigger wood in there to create a diversity of products. And the one thing we got out of the conference was you need multiple streams in, you need multiple streams out, so that enhances that. But we have a great supply and actually a great location for both internal state uses and external exporting. You know, we're the first forest along the main line railroad to Long Beach.
Yep.
Outside of California, and the supply we have here is pretty extensive. There are emerging markets. There's demands out there for things, and markets are starting to emerge to produce those things. So we're trying to work to connect the two together, and that's the challenge, is finding a model that works. Because you're right, this low value product of juniper and biomass, you really lose the profitability if you have to truck it very far.
Right.
So there's a lot of different models. Some of the models is a wood campus where you bring the supply to there, and it can do a lot of different industries are there and can do different things with it. Personally, I think the better model in a lot of the area would be trying to figure out, like you said, the processing out in the woods and shipping from the woods
Right.
a marketable product at that point, instead of shipping a raw material to a mill, which is the old model, creating that shippable product out in the woods and then shipping it directly to the customer.
And
I feel that that's going to be a very beneficial model, and
reducing weight, getting the water out of it.
correct, because you don't want to ship the water.
One good thing about Arizona's climate, it will dry out wood. And that's a lot of the cost of shipping, is the weight of water.
Yeah,
So-
when you're shipping trees, you're shipping a lot of water and air.
Well, I want to defend why I'm excited about the essential oils, and it doesn't have anything to do with the aroma. It has to do with the process. And I'm not good at explaining this, so I'm going to set this up and then I'm going to ask you gentlemen to finish it. We're going to get to use our woody mass twice, because with essential oils, they go in and remove the oil. And that's the only thing they're interested in. So then we still have that product to use for a secondary. Why wouldn't I be excited about using one product twice and getting paid twice?
Right.
And actually, most of the presentations indicated multiple product streams coming out.
Yes.
Essential oils, biochar, depending on, but it gives you multiple routes to even their business, you know, even the business
Profit
flows.
points.
They can have multiple products coming out of the raw material.
You know what? I've never asked this question, but after they remove the oils, how much drying would we still have to do? Would that
Well,
pretty well dry it?
My understanding is that the oils are a byproduct of removing the water.
Right.
Right,
So
that's
as-
my
correct. So they're
So
just-
as it's compressed, you get the steam off, they get the essential oils out of the steam, and then the wood product continues on its way to becoming biochar or whatever.
Okay, now you know exactly why I'm so excited.
And that's innovation.
And I think,
Innovation, yeah.
I think you brought up a good point about the amount of supply. And I think we had a couple of people get up and talk.
They
One was a
did.
person that talked about economic viability of the models that were being discussed, and also the amount of product we have here. And I think I remember one person saying that we have like a 25-year supply, and at the end of that 25 years, you're really going to go back and start working on the land you cleared in the first year. So you basically have pretty much an unlimited supply. Is that correct?
Right.
That's a very important point you made, because we had some doubters that said, well, once you clear all those biomass, then what? Well, it all, unfortunately all comes back. And so we have an endless opportunity, endless.
But if the harvesting is economically sustainable, for businesses, I mean, you're creating jobs. That's
Yes.
the other positive of this. We're seeing return of an industry to Prescott area. Remember years ago, Russ and I are natives, and there used to be a little sawmill out here. We haven't seen that for decades. And getting that back, getting the jobs back for forest harvesting all the way through production of the material. It's a new industry.
And I think the other thing too is, the ranchers came in with a lot of perspectives that I think everybody need to hear.
Absolutely.
And because they have some limitations being put on them. One rancher indicated that, he's cleared 35,000 acres at a pretty economical price, from what I understand.
Very.
He's been willing to even go on to his grazing allotments on forest land, U.S. forest land, and do some clearing there so that would improve the grazing and improve the conditions of the forest. And he's been told by the Forest Service no. So,
And don't forget, it took him 5 years to tell him no.
yes, the first time, and then
And then
3 years on the
3
second
years,
time. I don't know why it takes so long to say no, but apparently there's a need to change some laws. And again, I think if we all work together, the BLM, the U.S. Forest Service, the Arizona with their trust lands, and the owners, there's no doubt in my mind that we have an adequate supply here
Oh,
to support an industry.
that was made very clear by the 5 companies that came such long distances to be a part of this conversation. They need a product, and they're telling us we have more than we understand we have.
Right. And, I know when I talked to Jeff Whitney, the state forester, he indicated he would like to see Yavapai County become kind of a test case for the Southwest on how to establish and develop a biomass industry. So maybe we could just talk for a few minutes about what we've done up to now to try and maybe even have a test burn up at Drake, and where that product is coming from and what we're trying to get out of that in a way of information.
Well, it's fortunate that we did start on this really about a year ago, and we received some grant monies to do some of the background studies that we needed to conduct for industry, so that they understood supply and cost for removal and transport and all that. But one of the things we did was a test harvest using some innovative equipment, Ponzi equipment, and we learned a lot about how much. Practically how much it costs to harvest and how much material you get. But one of the benefits was a big pile of brush, cut juniper and other brush. Now it's important because now Drake Cement out there north of Paulden is willing to test fire wood chips from ponderosa and juniper forests along with their process of making cement. And now we have a pile available on some private ground. The owner of the pile is willing to let us use it. We harvested it, and we're going to chip it and send it to Drake Cement to see how well it works in their process. It's important because it is, I guess, creating cement is also chemical. It's, it's not just heat, but the type of material that's put in there also adds some chemical components to the cement. So they need to understand all of that. But it would be mixing the chips in one case, and then in another case, we're going to use some of this bio coal from Mexico, Missouri, in association with some of these tests. So that's going to be occurring in early December, I believe.
I think it's occurring now.
Now,
Oh,
it's
it is.
It's
occurring
a
now.
month-long process and they're in it.
Yeah.
Okay, but we're going to give them the juniper.
The juniper,
at the end of the month.
there's multiple things they're trying, and so yeah, each different item is slated a different time frame to burn.
And didn't we hear and learn along the way that the product that can come from juniper burns hotter than coal?
The bio coals that they
The
present
bio coal,
were very similar to coal.
right.
Juniper has a lot of BTU,
But it's
so
cleaner.
It's far
totally
cleaner.
cleaner.
And
Yes.
the neat thing about the bio coal is it allows for utilization of the exact same process as the coal uses, because wood chips are difficult to mix in with coal with how they move, how they
Right.
burn the coal.
Well,
The bio coal will handle just like coal.
I bring this up because it's another side unintended benefit from all of our biomass.
Right.
And I'm sorry, I want clean air. I can't imagine anyone that wouldn't say, go,
Yeah.
go for this.
Well, I'm very interested in seeing how this test burn turns out, and the fact that we were able to get utilization of the material we've already cleared off the lands. We're running out of time, and I want to thank my guests for taking time out of their day to come in and help discuss this complex subject. It has more moving parts than anybody would ever realize.
It's a
So
fact.
thank you for coming in, and thank you for watching, and we'll have another great subject to talk about next month.